Mr. Hanley, you may proceed.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the committee for the opportunity to be here and to speak to you about the growing crisis in American transit. I represent the people of the Amalgamated Transit Union. We have 200,000 members in the U.S. and Canada. Our people drive buses and trains throughout the United States in all 48 contiguous states anyway. And I want to speak also on behalf of the 35 million people who ride buses and trains in the U.S. every day. We have been through a transit crisis since the beginning of the recession. Throughout the United States, cities have been challenged to continue operating their existing service. There has been no help from the federal government to try and alleviate that problem. We have seen 90% of the cities in the U.S. raise fares, cut service, and with that comes the deterioration of routes that have existed for over 100 years in some places, including my own hometown. The riders are angry, and we know it. We see it first. In a lot of ways, bus drivers are the canary in the coal mine for these problems. The angry riders are now boarding buses in record numbers, beating up our drivers. Remember that our drivers put a uniform on every day and go into neighborhoods and become the curbside tax collectors, something that nobody else really has to do. And as they do that, and they go into areas where they're providing less service, where people have to wait on corners longer, and then they tell people that the fares have gone up, they often get beaten up. And we have a record number of people who have been assaulted over the course of the last several years. And it's a growing problem and, frankly, an unnecessary one. But throughout the U.S., as people have been challenged with their transit, they have lost jobs. There are places, and there have been stories published often about the fact that with the deterioration of transit services, and in some places, such as just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, where a county eliminated all of their bus service, people have been left stranded, unable to get to work. We need to change completely the way we view transit, especially in light of what's happening in our cities. 81% of Americans currently live in metropolitan areas, and the size of those metropolitan areas is about to explode. It's anticipated in the next 20 years that those populations will grow by 1/3. And young people today are rejecting the car. This is actually good news for America, because we will not be able to sustain more cars on our roads in coming years. And young people today are saying, no, I don't want to even get a driver's license. Fewer young people today hold driver's licenses as a percentage of the population than did when John F. Kennedy was the president. And that is another canary in the coal mine. That tells us that as cities grow and as younger people reject riding in cars and say, I want to ride on transit, this government has to step up and provide it. That requires not only all the things that my colleagues have testified to today in terms of funding, it also requires a vision. You have to sit down and say, wait a minute, where are we going in urban America? What are the needs going to be in 5 and 10 years? In places like New York, where it's anticipated in 12 years, the population of metropolitan New York is going to reach 21 million people. Where are they going to go to get to work? So transit is not only a huge driver for mobility for Americans, but their mobility is what leads to social mobility. And if, in fact, we care about inequality in America, we have to turn and say, what are the things that enable people to get to work, to be productive citizens? How can we energize this economy? And frankly, this is one place where people have not paid enough attention over the course of the last several years. And I thank you for the opportunity again, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Hanley, ATU's reauthorization proposal makes a number of recommendations to improve ATA paratransit service that complements fixed route service. What are the best means to assess the quality of paratransit service in communities?
I would guess how people feel about the systems. We do not do analysis on a regular basis in local areas about paratransit. We have a very strong sense of what's happening out there, and the problem is that there have not been funds made available to agencies to operate their systems. And this is general. This is not just paratransit. But as the needs of America have grown for more paratransit, and nobody has stepped up to provide the amount of funding that these systems need. There have been strains placed on them. There are places where systems are actually cutting back on the service they provide to people in need of paratransit, but also there's a strain on the general budget of these agencies because there is a bias in Washington that we will not provide operating aid to transit systems anymore, at least large transit systems. So, you know, frankly, I think that the systems are underfunded and that we need to reopen the discussion, as Senator Clinton did, about operating aid for transit systems.
People often think of Idaho as a rural state, and it is mostly, but urban transportation is increasingly a bigger deal there. I want to focus on rural transportation at first, though. In our hearing last month, the Federal Transit Administration recognized that new rules need to be tailored in a way that, frankly, don't unduly or disproportionately burden our smaller and our rural systems. Rural operators already have a strong record of safety. So what can we do on this front? What would you recommend?
Congress needs to pay more attention to some of the escape doors that particularly private companies are finding to avoid regulation. There's one that happened right here in Washington, D.C., where a private company that provides paratransit for WMATA removed one of the seats from each of their vans to escape federal drug testing regulations. So that people that are now riding around in vans who are disabled in Washington, D.C., have drivers that are not drug tested, despite the fact that this is a policy of the federal government, and they got around it by removing a seat, so they had, instead of 9, 8 seats in their vans. That's the kind of, and there have been other stories that have come out about bonuses being given in these companies to managers that cut corners and make more profit, and that almost always comes at the expense of safety. So I would caution that we really need to pay close attention to what they're doing out there and not abandon strong regulations and also strong enforcement of those regulations with analysis that goes with it.
That's a good point. We need to make sure we protect safety and soundness. We also need to make sure that we don't overly burden the regulatory structure so that our smaller systems face difficulties. With the short time I have left, I just can't resist, Mr. Hanley, coming back to something you said in your testimony. And I just want you to explain it a little bit more to me, if you would. And that is, if I heard you correctly, you said that there are fewer people today who hold driver's licenses than in the time of JFK. Is that?
No.
Or did
What I said is that fewer young people, as a percentage of their population, are holding driver's licenses. They don't drive cars the way that we did when we were kids. They don't get licenses. They have chosen public transit. And that's part of why you see the numbers growing so well in cities of people riding transit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. I want to particularly thank you, Mr. Hanley, for your very thoughtful and eloquent sort of discussion of how this issue has broad impact on equality, access to work, you know, getting your share of the American dream. I thank you for that. And your colleagues up in Division 618 in Rhode Island have just celebrated their 100th anniversary, so you represent some very dedicated and thoughtful men and women, so thank you for that. But a point you raised is a very serious one, and that is that there are increasing physical threats and other threats to transit systems throughout the country, not just in the Northeast, but across the country. And there are also, as we understand, there are systems, big city systems, that have their own transit police forces, but I don't think that's the case in South Dakota, and it's not the case in Rhode Island either. So we depend, the transit system essentially has to provide its first line of defense and protection. Map 21 narrowed the capital investment flexibility for crime prevention security, so that the funds that previously could be used you know, under rules and regulations to invest in cameras, communication devices, et cetera, for security purposes, that's not not now under Map 21. So my sense, Mr. Hanley, is you would urge us to go back and look at that and try to provide more resources for physical security for bus systems across the country.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, you know, I speak now as a bus driver, as somebody who has been assaulted driving a bus. It's something that has gone on, particularly in times of economic downturn. It expands as an issue for us. And we believe that what needs to be done, in addition to providing adequate police protection, is a re-engineering of the bus operator's workstation. They have, over the course of the last several years, been installing in buses aftermarket protectors, windows that have been put up around the driver to protect the driver from assault. The problem is that it's a very uncomfortable setup for a driver. Nobody has looked at re-engineering drivers' workstations in the last 40 years. And we think that what has to happen is that funding has to be provided, but also agencies have to be encouraged when they order buses to actually do a study of what a driver's needs are and build in the build into the engineering bus driver protection.
So the first step is for both the manufacturers and the transit agencies to come up with the state-of-the-art equipment, and then our role would be to authorize on the capital investment necessary to do that.
And we'd actually like you to bring pressure on the companies to do this because it is rarely a high priority for them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Crapo, for holding this hearing, and thank you all for being here. So I want to go back to something I asked about in the January hearing that we had on MAP 21, and that is about how Congress has said in the program to distribute the money. And as we know, there are two ways that the money can be distributed. Part of it can be distributed through a very fixed formula. It goes so much to states and so much to localities by a set formula. And then part of it is potentially left to the discretion of the FTA so that a locality or a state can bid competitively in order to be able to do that in that process. And that historically, the money has been divided about 80-20. That is, that 80 goes to a fixed formula and about 20 goes to discretionary spending. But that under MAP 21, we switched over to 91% goes by formula, and there's only 8% left for discretionary spending. And that means very clearly in the last authorization, we moved away from more discretion. So in the January hearing, I asked the Federal Transit Administrator, Rogoff, about whether the sharp decrease in discretionary funding had an impact. And what he pointed out is that it made it much more difficult for transit agencies, and particularly for bus operators, to take on big projects like constructing new maintenance facilities. So I just wanted to go down the panel, if I could here, and see if I could get some kind of quick answer about whether you think the decrease in discretionary funding as a proportion of MAP 21 has made it harder for state and local agencies to make the necessary large dollar investments that they need to make.
Discretion can be a good thing, but also that the federal government needs to establish some standard for what the return on investment is for these local agencies. I could give you some very annoying facts about the way in which some agencies, particularly in New York, have spent their capital funds, spending huge amounts of money that will serve very few people. So I do think that there has to be some analysis of how that comes out on the other end, although generally, as a rule, I would say discretion for local agencies to figure these things out is a good thing.
Well, I appreciate it, and I think that's actually a very good point about what kind of constraints you want to put in this. We all want to spend our federal dollars in the most effective way possible, and I'm just concerned about the move to formulaic funding, and hope that this is one of the things we'll think about as we talk about the reauthorization of MAP 21, how the dollars are divided up. But now I want to go to the point you were raising, and that is how many dollars we put into this system. You know, as you know, infrastructure investment creates jobs both in the short term and in the long term. In Massachusetts, across the country, We have roads and bridges that are in need of repair. We have rail and mass transit expansion projects that would allow businesses to grow. We do a good job of identifying our transportation needs, but that's only half the equation. The second is how we pay for infrastructure repairs and upgrades. So when MAP 21 was enacted last July, it was partially funded by increasing the PBGC pension insurance premiums by 40% over 2 years and through pension smoothing, which allows companies to contribute less to the pension funds now but can leave those plans underfunded in the future. This raises money in a 10-year budget window, but ultimately it means that retirees and future retirees will potentially be on the hook here. Investing in infrastructure is critical to our future, but we shouldn't be doing it on the backs of retirees, the way this was funded in the past. The Highway Trust Fund has been funding critical projects for over half a century by taxing gasoline and diesel fuel, but now we're facing a serious dilemma. The trust fund is nearly empty. Increasing fuel efficiency means that we're bringing in less revenue. So we all have the same concerns about rail and mass transit. Raising ticket prices means that we'll end up funding the system on the backs of those who have fixed incomes, retirees, who have to rely on mass transit. So what I really want to bring this down to is where we're going to get the money. When Congress says no more spending no matter what, even on important things like mass transit, like roads and bridges, what they're really saying is they'd rather preserve tax loopholes that primarily benefit a few people rather than make the investment in infrastructure that benefits the whole economy. So I see that I'm out of time, and I will just simply ask the question, if you could answer very briefly, you could probably give this a yes or no. Are we underinvesting in our mass transit and our infrastructure spending? And I'll start the other way. Mr. Hanley?
Outrageously so, particularly in light of what I have pointed out about young people in America and the growing population of our cities.
It seems to me that if you can't have the very guts of the system be in a state that can actually make billions of rider trips, particularly in places like the Northeast, but other places in the country, then you can't achieve the type of transit system that creates that economic engine. Finally, President Hanley, I appreciate your leadership and your organization and your insights. Your testimony notes that between 1998 and 2009, private contracting, for example, for regular bus service doubled. And I know we hear this move towards privatization in an attempt to save money, yet privatization often has hidden costs that don't surface when the switch is made. You propose a new method of calculating these hidden costs, which you call the avoidable cost model. Can you explain how that model would work and how it would help transit agencies in making some sound investment decisions?
First of all, the best way I can explain what's happened in terms of the starvation of our systems, including the privatization of them, is to take you into a meeting I was at with 25 of our local presidents, brand new presidents who had just gotten elected in various parts of the union. And one of them stood up in the course of a discussion we had, and he said, you know, and he's from Dayton, Ohio, and he said, you know, I have members who work full-time, they've been there for 10 years, and they make $12 an hour. And they qualify for social services. And that got my attention. And I said, well, wait a minute, you know, how could that be? And I said, well, how many people in this room have that same issue, where you have members who are driving buses, fixing buses, working full-time, but qualify for social services? Every one of them in the room raised their hands except for the Canadians. That's what happened. And I was stunned, you know, that in our industry, because, you know, often in the larger cities, we think of transit workers as being decently paid. But the fact of the matter is, you know, as has been pointed out this morning, most of them are not. And most of them are out there living on very low wages. And the effect, the impact, and the secondary costs of privatization include stripping Americans of their pensions. I just want to point out that one of the largest companies that does this in America is a French-based company named Veolia that is owned by the French Social Security system. And they have a policy in the United States that no worker who works in their transit systems will have a pension. And in fact, no workers who work for Veolia in the U.S. have a pension. And that has long-term implications on our people. It has long-term implications on our country. And frankly, you know, we have to have priorities. I want you to know first that in 75% of the cases where the American people, taxpayers, are given the opportunity to vote to raise their own taxes for transit in referenda, they say yes. 75% of these referenda are passing. The American people are very willing to raise their taxes to pay for a transit system that they know helps the environment and helps the economy, as you pointed out, Senator. But the fact of the matter is that we have different priorities nationally, and we ought to rethink them, in addition to which, as Senator Warren said, I think we have to be, or I paraphrase, less timid about going to the American people and talking to them about revenue, because they're willing to pay for it. They just need to know what they're paying for. And some of the priorities we have, such as our huge war machine, I think really need to be questioned. And I know that's not a popular thing to talk about or to say, but the fact of the matter is that the amount of money we spend all over the world defending the American way of life while we diminish the American way of life every single day it really raises the question, what are we defending? If we can't defend our Social Security system, if we can't defend our pensions, if we can't defend these people who work in every transit system in America who also qualify for social services, what are we defending? I'm at a loss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.